It was a perfect spring morning in St. Mary Mead, the kind that made even the most hardened souls believe that evil could not possibly exist in such a gentle place. The daffodils nodded cheerfully along the lanes, and the air carried the faint sweetness of apple blossom from the orchards beyond the churchyard. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, something dark had already taken root. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual window seat, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a soft blue shawl for the new baby at the vicarage. Her blue eyes, still remarkably sharp for a woman of her years, occasionally lifted to observe the quiet street outside. She had lived in this village long enough to know that peace was often only a thin veil drawn over deeper currents. The telephone rang at 10:30. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice unusually strained. "Jane, dear, something dreadful has happened at Rose Cottage. You'd better come at once. The police are already there." Miss Marple did not waste time with questions. She set aside her knitting, put on her good grey coat and hat, and walked briskly down the high street. Rose Cottage belonged to the Hartley family, or rather, to young Mrs. Sylvia Hartley, who had come to the village only 2 years earlier after her marriage to Gerald Hartley, the local solicitor. When Miss Marple arrived, a small crowd had already gathered at a respectful distance from the pretty whitewashed cottage with its climbing roses. Constable Higgs stood at the gate, looking important and slightly pale. Dr. Haydock's old car was parked crookedly beside the police vehicle. Mrs. Bantry met her at the garden path, with her usually cheerful face drawn with worry. "It's Sylvia," she whispered. "They found her this morning, dead in her bedroom. Gerald is in a terrible state. He keeps saying it can't be true." Miss Marple nodded calmly, though her mind was already working. "What exactly happened, Dolly?" "They say it looks like heart failure or some sort of sudden collapse, but there's something odd about it. Come inside if you can bear it." The bedroom upstairs was flooded with morning light. Sylvia Hartley lay on her bed as though she had simply fallen asleep after dressing for an important occasion. She was wearing an exquisite dress of deep emerald silk that shimmered like water in sunlight. The fabric was cut in the latest Paris fashion, with delicate beading along the neckline and sleeves that whispered of expense and elegance. It was the sort of dress one might wear to a grand ball or a sophisticated dinner in London. Certainly not something for an ordinary evening in St. Mary Mead. Yet the most striking thing was the expression on Sylvia's lovely face. There was no fear, no pain, only a faint look of surprise, as though she had seen something unexpected in her final moments. Dr. Haydock was closing his bag when Miss Marple entered. He looked up and gave her a grim nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. Nasty business. She was only 27. Beautiful girl. I've known her since she came here." "Cause of death, doctor?" asked Inspector Slack, who had arrived from Much Benham and was already looking irritable at the thought of a quiet village case turning complicated. "Difficult to say without a post-mortem," Haydock replied carefully. "The heart seems healthy enough from what I can see. No obvious signs of violence, but there's a faint odour. Something chemical, perhaps. I don't like it." Gerald Hartley sat on a chair by the window, his head in his hands. He was a tall, good-looking man in his early 30s, usually so composed and professional. Now his face was ashen, his eyes red-rimmed. "She was fine last night," he kept repeating. "We had dinner together. She seemed perfectly normal. Then she said she was tired and wanted to go to bed early. I worked in my study until midnight. When I came up, she was already like this." Miss Marple moved closer to the bed with the gentle respect of someone who had seen death many times before. She did not touch anything, but her eyes took in every detail. The perfectly arranged hair, the careful makeup that had not smudged, and the elegant shoes placed neatly beside the bed, as though Sylvia had intended to wear them. And then she noticed the dress. It was not merely beautiful. It was the dress Sylvia had sworn she would never wear again. Miss Marple had heard the story only a month ago during one of her afternoon teas. Sylvia had been invited to a charity ball in London by an old friend. She had ordered this very emerald silk dress from an expensive Mayfair couturier. When it arrived, she had tried it on in front of several ladies, including Miss Marple, who had been visiting Mrs. Bantry that day. "I look like a Christmas tree in it," Sylvia had laughed, twirling before the mirror. "Too bright, too showy. Gerald would hate it. I'm sending it straight back. I'll never wear this again, never." Yet here it was, perfectly fitted on her dead body, its every fold arranged with care, as though someone had dressed her with loving, or perhaps mocking, attention after death. Miss Marple's needles would have clicked faster had she been holding them. Instead, she folded her hands and spoke softly to Inspector Slack. "Such a lovely dress," she murmured. "Rather unusual for a quiet evening at home, wouldn't you say?" Slack grunted. "Women do strange things, Miss Marple. Maybe she wanted to feel beautiful one last time." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I remember her saying quite clearly that she disliked this particular dress. She found it too conspicuous." Gerald Hartley looked up sharply. "She did say that. She sent it back to the shop. I remember the parcel going out last month." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. "Then how did it get here?" No one had an answer, and Miss Marple moved to the dressing table. Everything was tidy, too tidy perhaps. A small bottle of French perfume stood open, its scent still lingering. Beside it lay a single white glove, the mate nowhere to be seen. And tucked beneath the edge of the mirror was a tiny scrap of paper, barely visible. With the inspector's permission, Miss Marple picked it up. It was a torn corner of a theatre programme from the Palladium in London, dated 3 weeks earlier. On the back, in delicate feminine handwriting, were the words, "Tonight, at 8, don't wear the green, he will be there." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She said nothing, but slipped the fragment into her handbag when no one was looking. A small, seemingly innocent detail, yet one that everyone else in the room had completely missed. Downstairs in the drawing room, the ladies of St. Mary Mead were already gathering with casseroles and concerned expressions. Miss Marple joined them quietly, listening as the village began to weave its own version of events. "She was always so lively," said Mrs. Price Ridley. "Such a pretty thing, too pretty perhaps." "Gerald adored her," added Miss Hartnell, "though I did hear they had words sometimes about her London friends." "Jealous, was he?" asked someone else. Miss Marple said little, but her mind was busy connecting threads. Sylvia Hartley had been popular, charming, and perhaps a little restless in the quiet of St. Mary Mead. She had kept up friendships in London, theatre people, artists, and one particular gentleman whose name had been mentioned more than once in hushed tones. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts turning over the emerald dress, the missing glove, the theatre ticket scrap, and the faint chemical smell Dr. Haydock had noticed. She sat down in her garden with a cup of tea and picked up her knitting once more. The blue shawl grew steadily under her fingers, while her mind worked on something far more intricate. "Poor child," she murmured to herself. "She said she would never wear that dress again, and yet someone made certain that she did." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "Very clever," she said softly, "but not quite clever enough." The news of Sylvia Hartley's death spread through St. Mary Mead like the first chill of autumn. Quietly at first, then with gathering force. By afternoon, every household had its own theory. Some spoke of a weak heart, inherited from her mother. Others whispered about sleeping tablets and the dangers of modern medicine. A few, more maliciously, suggested that Gerald Hartley had grown tired of his young wife's London ways and had helped her on her way. Miss Marple listened to it all without comment, as she took tea with her old friend Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall later that same day. The two women sat in the comfortable morning room, where the light fell softly through mullioned windows. Outside, the gardener was trimming the roses with deliberate, unhurried snips. "I can't stop thinking about that dress, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, stirring her tea vigorously. "Sylvia was so definite about it. She laughed and said it made her look like a cheap actress trying too hard. Why on earth would she put it on the very night she died?" Miss Marple set down her cup with care. "That, my dear Dolly, is precisely the question that troubles me most. People do not usually dress in clothes they dislike for their final hours. Unless, of course, someone else dressed them." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You mean after she was already dead?" "It is a possibility one must consider," Miss Marple replied gently, "though Dr. Haydock has not yet confirmed the cause. The inquest is tomorrow. We shall know more then." That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet call on Gerald Hartley. She found him alone in the drawing-room of Rose Cottage, surrounded by the small comforts of a life suddenly shattered. A fire burned low in the grate, although the evening was mild. He looked up as she entered, his face gaunt with exhaustion and grief. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Kind of you to come. Everyone has been so kind. But I keep seeing her lying there in that wretched dress. She hated it, you know. We argued about it when it arrived. She said it was vulgar, too bright for her taste. I told her it suited her perfectly. She sent it back the next day. I saw the return slip myself." Miss Marple sat down in the chair opposite him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Did you see the dress again after that?" "Never. The shop confirmed they received it. Sylvia even joked about it later, said she hoped some other poor woman would be foolish enough to buy it." His voice cracked. And now she was wearing it, as if she had changed her mind at the last moment. But why? She was happy here. We were happy. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Gerald Hartley had always struck her as a decent, a rather conventional man, the sort who enjoyed his golf, his bridge evenings, and the quiet respect his profession brought him in the village. Yet there was something restless in Sylvia that he had never quite understood. She had been an actress before their marriage, not a star, but good enough to have small parts in West End productions. London still called to her occasionally. "Mr. Hartley," Miss Marple said softly, "did your wife receive any visitors from London in the weeks before her death?" He hesitated, then nodded. "One or two. An old friend from her theatre days, Leonard Vale. He's a producer now, rather successful, I believe. And there was a woman called Mrs. Caroline Despard. She stayed at the Blue Boar for a night last month." Sylvia seemed pleased to see her. Although they spent most of their time talking about old times, Miss Marple noted the names in her mind. And on the night she died, Did anything unusual happen at dinner? Nothing at all. We had lamb chops, potatoes, and some of that excellent trifle Mrs. Price Ridley sent over. Sylvia ate well. She laughed at my silly stories about the office. Then she said she felt a little tired and would go up early. She kissed me good night quite normally. His eyes filled with sudden tears. If only I had gone up with her. Perhaps I could have. You must not blame yourself, Miss Marple said kindly. We can none of us see into the future. Tell me, did Sylvia mention any plans for the following day? She wanted to drive into Much Benham to choose new curtains for the sitting room. She was excited about it. He paused. There was one small thing, and when I went into the bedroom later to check on her, I noticed one of her white evening gloves lying on the floor near the bed. Only one. I picked it up and put it on the dressing table. I thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her face remained serene. A single glove. How very curious. The next morning the inquest was held in the village hall. The room was packed. Villagers sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces solemn, but their eyes bright with curiosity. Dr. Haydock gave evidence first. He stated that death had been caused by a massive dose of a powerful sedative, combined with a rare alkaloid not commonly found in ordinary sleeping draughts. The combination had stopped the heart almost instantly and painlessly. Could this have been self-administered? Asked the coroner. Oh, possible, Haydock replied cautiously, but the amount was far larger than any normal prescription. And the way it was taken, mixed perhaps in a late-night drink, suggests it was not accidental. The coroner looked grave. Are you suggesting foul play, Doctor? I am suggesting that this requires further police investigation, Haydock said firmly. Gerald Hartley testified next, his voice steady but hollow. He repeated what he had told Miss Marple. When asked about the emerald dress, he shook his head in bewilderment. I cannot explain it. My wife disliked that dress intensely. She returned it to the shop herself. I have the receipt. A murmur ran through the hall. Inspector Slack, looking more irritated than ever, produced the return slip as evidence. The shop in Mayfair had indeed received the dress and refunded the money. Yet the dress had been found on Sylvia's body, freshly pressed and perfectly fitted. Miss Marple sat quietly at the back, listening. When her turn came to speak, she had been called as a character witness for the deceased. She rose with quiet dignity. Sylvia Hartley was a charming young woman, she said in her soft, clear voice, full of life and warmth. She loved her husband and was making a happy home here. But she did once say to me, quite plainly, that she would never wear that particular green silk dress again, because it reminded her of an unhappy evening in London. She called it a dress of bad memories. The coroner raised his eyebrows. Bad memories, Miss Marple? Yes, she replied. She did not elaborate, but I had the impression it was connected with someone she once knew, someone who had caused her pain. The inquest returned an open verdict, pending further police inquiries. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Leonard Vale, who had arrived from London that morning. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, with smooth dark hair and the easy manners of the theatre world. Terrible business, he said, offering her his arm. Sylvia was one of the sweetest girls I ever worked with. We did a small play together years ago, The Moonlit Garden. She had real talent, you know, wasted here in this sleepy village. Yet she seemed content, Miss Marple observed mildly. Vale gave a short laugh, content, Sylvia. She was like a bird in a pretty cage. Gerald meant well, but he never understood her spirit. She wrote to me a few weeks ago. Said she was thinking of coming back to London for a new production. She sounded hopeful. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did she mention anyone else? A Mrs. Caroline Despard, perhaps? Vale's step faltered for the briefest moment. Caroline? Yes, they were old friends. Rather intense friendship, if you ask me. Caroline could be possessive. She didn't like Gerald much. Thought he had stolen Sylvia away from the stage. They had reached the gate of Rose Cottage. Vale took his leave with a charming smile, but Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes lingered on the upstairs window where Sylvia had died. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Blue Boar Inn and had a quiet word with the landlady, Mrs. Polkin. Yes, Mrs. Caroline Despard had stayed there last month. A stylish woman, rather sharp-tongued. She and Mrs. Hartley had dined together in the private parlour. They had seemed close, laughing at first, then arguing in low voices later in the evening. About what, I wonder? Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Polkin shrugged. Couldn't say, miss, but Mrs. Despard left looking upset. Said something about old promises and not letting go. Miss Marple walked home through the lengthening shadows of the churchyard. The yew trees stood dark and silent, as though guarding ancient secrets. In her mind, the pieces were beginning to shift and form faint patterns. The dress, the single glove, the theatre programme scrap, the mysterious alkaloid, the old friends from London, the husband who seemed genuinely heartbroken, the woman who had once been possessive, and above all, and with a strange certainty that someone had wanted Sylvia Hartley to wear that emerald silk dress one final time, the dress she had sworn she would never wear again. Miss Marple paused by the lich gate and looked back toward Rose Cottage, its windows now dark and empty. Someone hated her enough to kill her, she said softly to herself, but loved her enough to dress her beautifully for death. How very human, and how very wicked. She adjusted her shawl and continued homeward, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The quiet click of needles would soon begin again, but tonight they would measure out something far more complex than wool. The first threads of the mystery had been laid bare. Now it was time to follow them, however tangled they might become. The days following the inquest settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy mist that refused to lift. Outwardly, life continued in its familiar rhythm. The butcher's boy whistled on his rounds, children played hopscotch in the schoolyard, and the church bells rang for evensong with their usual comforting steadiness. Yet beneath the surface, unease rippled through every conversation. Sylvia Hartley's death was no longer simply a tragedy. It had become a puzzle that no one could quite set aside. Miss Marple spent the next morning in her garden, ostensibly pruning her beloved roses, but her thoughts were far from horticulture. She had always found that her hands kept busy, while her mind worked best in quiet solitude. The single white glove, the torn theatre programme, the emerald dress that had mysteriously reappeared, these details danced in her memory like fragments of a half-remembered dream. A gentle knock at the garden gate interrupted her reverie. It was Raymond West, her nephew, who had driven down from London upon hearing the news. He was a successful novelist now, with a keen eye for human drama, though he still teased his aunt about her village mysteries. "Aunt Jane," he said, kissing her cheek, "you look as though you're plotting the downfall of half the county. Is it true what they're saying in the papers? Poison in a quiet English village." Miss Marple smiled faintly and offered him a seat on the wrought-iron bench. "The papers do love their headlines, Raymond. But yes, poor Sylvia was poisoned. And the dress she wore, it is the most curious part of all." She told him everything she had observed. The dress Sylvia had returned to the shop, the single glove, the scrap of theatre programme with its cryptic warning. Raymond listened intently, his writer's mind already spinning possibilities. "Sounds like a classic locked-room puzzle," he said, lighting a cigarette. "But with an emotional twist. Who would want to kill a young woman everyone seemed to like? And why go to the trouble of dressing her in something she hated?" "That is exactly what troubles me," Miss Marple replied. "It feels personal, almost intimate, as though the murderer wanted her to look beautiful in death, yet chose the one garment that carried painful memories for her. It suggests both hatred and a strange kind of love." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "As you're thinking of the husband. Gerald Hartley is genuinely grieving," Miss Marple said softly. "I have seen enough sorrow in my life to recognize the real thing. No, I think the answer lies in London, in the world Sylvia left behind when she married and came to St. Mary Mead." That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Caroline Despard. She had learned from the landlady at the Blue Boar that Mrs. Despard had returned to the village the day after the inquest, staying once again at the inn. "Claimed she wanted to pay her respects," Mrs. Palkin had said with a sniff, "but I think she's here for something else." Caroline Despard proved to be a striking woman in her early 40s, with sharp features, elegantly coiffed dark hair, and eyes that missed very little, and she received Miss Marple in the private sitting-room of the Blue Boar, a cigarette holder in one hand and a glass of sherry in the other. "So you're the famous Miss Marple," she said, her voice carrying the cultured drawl of London society. "Sylvia spoke of you once or twice, the wise old lady who notices everything. Have you come to solve the mystery already?" Miss Marple took the offered chair with quiet dignity. "I notice small things, Mrs. Despard, little details that others sometimes overlook. For instance, I understand you and Sylvia were close friends for many years." "Very close," Caroline replied, her tone softening for a moment. "We met when we were both struggling young actresses. Shared digs, shared dreams, shared disappointments. Sylvia had real talent, you know. She could have been someone. And then Gerald Hartley came along with his solid respectability and his dull little solicitor's practice. He swept her off to this charming backwater, and that was the end of her career." "Did she regret the marriage?" Miss Marple asked gently. Caroline's laugh was short and bitter. "Regret? She told me she felt buried alive here. The endless tea parties, the gossip about curtains and church fetes. She wrote to me often, saying she missed the theatre, the excitement, the people who understood her. I begged her to leave him. I even offered to help her restart in London. And did she consider it?" Caroline's eyes narrowed. "She was thinking about it. We met here last month. She was excited about a new play Leonard Vale was producing. A good part for her, the kind she used to shine in. But Gerald found out about our meeting. They quarrelled. Sylvia told me he accused her of being unfaithful, of wanting to throw away their life together for silly theatrical nonsense." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And the emerald dress. Sylvia mentioned it, reminded her of an unhappy evening." Caroline stubbed out her cigarette with unnecessary force. "That dress was for the first night of a play we did together years ago. Sylvia wore it on stage and received glowing reviews. But that same night, the leading man, a cad named Victor Lang broke her heart. He promised her the world and then ran off with someone richer. Sylvia swore she would never wear green again, because it brought back that humiliation. She returned the dress because it carried too many ghosts. Yet someone brought it back and put it on her, Miss Marple said quietly. Caroline's face hardened. Yes, as someone who knew exactly how much it would hurt her. Someone who wanted her to die, remembering her failures. The conversation turned to Leonard Vale. Caroline spoke of him with cool dislike. Leonard is charming, talented, and completely ruthless. He was in love with Sylvia once, or at least wanted her for his productions. When she married Gerald, he never quite forgave her. He kept writing, kept offering parts, kept reminding her of what she had given up. Miss Marple left the Blue Boar with her thoughts more tangled than before. Caroline Despard's possessiveness was evident, her jealousy of Gerald Hartley palpable. Yet there was genuine grief beneath her sharp words. Leonard Vale, on the other hand, seemed to move in shadows, a man who profited from other people's emotions. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage. The vicar's wife had organised a modest supper to lift spirits, though the shadow of death hung over the table. Gerald Hartley was there, looking thinner and older. He sat quietly, speaking little. Across from him sat Leonard Vale, who had been invited out of politeness. Conversation inevitably turned to Sylvia. Miss Hartnell spoke warmly of her kindness to the village children. Mrs. Price Ridley recalled her beautiful singing voice at the church concert last Christmas. Then Leonard Vale leaned forward, his voice smooth. Sylvia was wasted here, he said. She had fire, talent, beauty. Gerald, old chap, you must have known she was never meant for village life. Gerald's hands tightened around his glass. She was happy with me. We were building a life together. Were you? Vale asked softly. Or was she simply pretending, for your sake? The tension in the room thickened. Miss Marple observed the exchange with quiet attention. There was hatred in Vale's polished words and pain in Gerald's restrained anger. Caroline Despard had not been invited, but her presence seemed to hover nonetheless. Later, as the guests departed, Miss Marple found herself walking part of the way home with Dr. Haydock. The old doctor was unusually sombre. That alkaloid is tricky stuff, Jane, he said. Rare, expensive, and difficult to obtain unless one has certain connections. Theatre people sometimes use strange remedies for nerves or insomnia. It could have come from London. Miss Marple nodded. And the dress? How do you think it returned to Rose Cottage? Haydock shrugged. Or someone collected it from the shop using false pretenses, perhaps, or bribed an assistant. The important thing is that it was brought here deliberately. This was no impulsive crime, Jane. It was planned with care, and with a touch of theatrical flair. As Miss Marple reached her own cottage, the moon had risen, silvering the thatched roofs and quiet gardens of St. Mary Mead. She paused at her gate and looked up at the stars. Someone dressed her in the dress of bad memories, she whispered. Someone who knew her heartaches better than her own husband. Someone who wanted her to leave this world wearing the symbol of everything she had tried to forget. Inside, she lit the lamp and took up her knitting once more. The blue shawl was growing, row by careful row, but in her mind she was knitting together something far more delicate and dangerous, a pattern of jealousy, old love, broken promises, and one final, fatal performance. The dress had been worn again, against Sylvia's solemn vow. Now it was Miss Marple's quiet task to discover who had forced her into it, and why. The following morning brought a soft drizzle to St. Mary Mead, the kind that turned garden paths into gentle mud, and made the villagers linger longer over their breakfast tables. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let weather interfere with her quiet inquiries. She put on her stout walking shoes, took her umbrella, and set off toward the post office, where village news flowed as reliably as the River Stour. Young Gladys, the postmistress's assistant, who was only too eager to chat when Miss Marple mentioned Sylvia Hartley in passing. "Such a shame, miss. Mrs. Hartley was always so friendly when she came for her letters. She got quite a few from London, you know. Thick cream envelopes with that fancy handwriting. One arrived the very day before well, you know." Miss Marple's needles would have clicked faster had she been knitting. "Did you happen to notice the sender, Gladys dear?" Gladys lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Couldn't say for certain, but the last one had a London postmark and smelled ever so faintly of expensive perfume, like the kind actresses use. And Mr. Hartley, he looked a bit put out when he saw the pile on the hall table that morning. Not angry exactly, but worried." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on her way, and the drizzle now matching the steady drip of information in her mind. Letters from London. A husband who worried. A dress that carried memories of betrayal. The pattern was becoming clearer, yet still frustratingly incomplete. She decided to call again at Rose Cottage. Gerald Hartley received her in the study, where he had been sorting through Sylvia's belongings. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. On the desk lay a small stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. "I can't bring myself to burn them yet," he said quietly, gesturing to the letters. "They were her private things, but perhaps you should see them, Miss Marple. You seem to understand more than most." Miss Marple accepted the bundle with gentle hands. Most were from Leonard Vale. Enthusiastic notes about new plays, offers of parts, reminders of the old days when we were young and hungry. One, dated 3 weeks before Sylvia's death, was more insistent. "Come back, Sylvia. The part is perfect for you. Gerald will never understand what you are sacrificing. Leave him before it's too late. I can help you start again. We could be brilliant together." There were 2 letters from Caroline Despard as well. The first was affectionate, full of shared memories and gentle persuasion. The second, written after their meeting at the Blue Boar, was sharper. "You promised me once that you would never let a man cage you. Don't break that promise now. If you stay with him, you'll fade away. I won't stand by and watch it happen. Remember what we meant to each other." Miss Marple looked up. "Your wife kept these, Mr. Hartley. Did you know about them?" Gerald ran a hand through his hair. "I suspected. Sylvia was never good at hiding her feelings. We argued about Leonard Vale more than once. She said he was just an old friend offering professional help, but I could see how his letters excited her. As for Caroline, I never understood that friendship. It always seemed too intense, almost jealous. Sylvia laughed when I mentioned it, said I was imagining things." He paused, his voice dropping. "The night she died, after dinner she went upstairs. I stayed in here working on some conveyancing papers. Around 11, I heard her moving about, drawers opening and closing. I thought she was getting ready for bed. If only I had gone up sooner." Miss Marple's eyes softened with genuine compassion. "You must not torture yourself with if-onlys, Mr. Hartley. Tell me, did you notice anything else unusual that evening? Any phone calls? Any visitors? Nothing. The telephone was silent. No one called at the house. He hesitated, except there was a delivery earlier in the evening, a parcel from London. Sylvia took it upstairs herself. She seemed pleased when she saw the label. "A parcel?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Do you know what was in it?" I assumed it was something she had ordered. Fabric samples for the new curtains, perhaps. She was always planning little improvements to the house. I didn't ask. Miss Marple made a mental note. A parcel, arriving on the very day of her death. The emerald dress that had supposedly been returned to Mayfair. The pieces were beginning to fit together in a disturbing way. Later that afternoon, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, was looking harassed and out of place among her chintz curtains and delicate china. He had come, he said gruffly, because Dr. Haydock had suggested she might have useful observations. "Useful observations," he snorted, accepting a cup of tea. "Village gossip, more like. But the Chief Constable thinks highly of you, Miss Marple, so here I am." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. "The dress, Inspector. Have you traced its movements after it was returned to the shop?" Slack nodded reluctantly. "We have. The Mayfair shop confirms the return. But 2 days later, a woman matching Sylvia's description, or rather someone using her name, collected it again, claiming there had been a mistake, and she wanted to keep it after all, paid cash. And the assistant remembers her because she seemed nervous and kept her hat low." "Someone impersonating Sylvia," Miss Marple murmured. "How very clever! And the parcel Mr. Hartley mentioned, the one delivered on the evening of her death?" Slack's eyebrows rose. "How did you know about that?" "Small details, Inspector. Village life teaches one to notice them." He sighed. The parcel was from a theatrical costumier in Covent Garden. It contained the emerald dress, carefully wrapped, along with a note in Sylvia's own handwriting, or a very good forgery of it. The note said, "I've changed my mind. Please have it pressed and delivered tonight. I want to wear it one last time." Miss Marple set her cup down. One last time. The murderer used her own words against her, or words made to look like hers. The dress was delivered. She opened it, and then someone persuaded her, or forced her, to put it on, Slack finished. But why? What's the point of such theatrical nonsense if the goal was simply murder? Because it was not simply murder, Miss Marple said quietly. It was a performance, a final, cruel performance meant to remind Sylvia, or perhaps to punish her, for choices she had made. The dress of bad memories, the dress she swore she would never wear again. Someone wanted her to break that vow in the most final way possible. Slack looked uncomfortable. "You're suggesting one of her London friends did this? Vale, or that disbarred woman?" "Both had motives rooted in the past," Miss Marple replied. "Leonard Vale wanted her back on stage, and perhaps back in his life. Caroline Despard wanted her away from Gerald, back in the world they once shared. Jealousy can take many forms, Inspector. Sometimes it masquerades as love, sometimes as friendship." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Leonard Vale, arriving unannounced with a bunch of hothouse lilies. "For you, Miss Marple," he said with his charming smile. "I thought you might appreciate something beautiful after all this ugliness." She thanked him graciously and invited him in. Over tea, Vale spoke freely about Sylvia. "She was my muse once," he confessed. "We were very close during the moonlit garden. The critics said we had magic together. Then Gerald appeared, steady, reliable Gerald, and she threw it all away for domestic bliss. I tried to warn her. Marriage to a country solicitor would suffocate her spirit. And yet she seemed content here, Miss Marple observed. Oh, contentment is not the same as happiness, Vale replied sharply. Sylvia was restless. She wrote to me that she was considering a separation. She even asked if I could find her a flat in London. I told her I would do anything for her. Anything? Miss Marple asked gently. Vale's eyes met hers for a long moment. Anything within reason, of course. After he left, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the fire. The lilies filled the room with heavy sweetness. She thought of Sylvia opening the parcel, seeing the dress she hated, perhaps reading a note that played on her old dreams and fears. Had she put it on willingly, hoping to recapture something lost? Or had someone been in the room with her, persuading her with soft words or threats? Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and a pale moon broke through the clouds. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the blue shawl growing steadily. But her real work was weaving together the threads of human emotion. Love turned sour, ambition thwarted, friendship twisted into possession. The dress had been worn again. Someone had made certain of that. And in that certainty lay the key to a carefully planned, coldly executed crime that wore the mask of tragedy. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful in the firelight. "Very clever," she murmured once more. But pride and jealousy have a way of leaving small, telling traces, and I have always been rather good at noticing traces. The drizzle of the previous day had given way to a crisp, clear morning that made the village look almost too pretty to hold such darkness. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and spent the first hour in her small kitchen preparing a simple breakfast, while her mind turned over the new pieces of the puzzle. The parcel from the theatrical costumier, the forged note in Sylvia's handwriting, the letters full of persuasion and veiled threats, all pointed to someone who knew Sylvia intimately, someone who understood both her dreams and her vulnerabilities. She had just finished her tea when the doorbell rang. It was young Cherry Baker, who helped with the cleaning twice a week, looking flushed and excited. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never guess what I heard at the butcher's this morning. Mrs. Hartley's maid, that quiet little Elsie from Much Benham, has been talking. She says on the night Mrs. Hartley died, she saw a figure slipping out of the garden gate around 10:30. A woman, she thinks, wearing a dark coat and a scarf over her head. Elsie was coming back from visiting her sister, and didn't think much of it at the time, but now she's frightened." Miss Marple's interest sharpened at once. "Did Elsie recognize the woman, Cherry dear?" She couldn't be sure. It was dark and the lady kept her face hidden, but she was tall and moved quickly, like someone used to London streets rather than village lanes. Elsie swears she saw her turn toward the Blue Boar direction. A woman, tall, moving with purpose. Miss Marple thanked Cherry and decided it was time for a more direct conversation with Elsie herself. She found the young maid at her sister's cottage on the edge of the village, darning socks with nervous fingers. Elsie was only 19, with wide eyes and a tendency to twist her apron when worried. I didn't want to say anything, miss," she confessed after Miss Marple had gently reassured her. "Mr. Hartley has been good to me, and I didn't want to cause trouble. But I did see someone. She came out of the side gate, the one near the apple trees. She walked fast, almost running. I thought maybe it was Mrs. Despard, because she's tall like that and has that proud way of carrying herself, but I can't swear to it." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "And earlier that evening, did you notice anything while you were helping Mrs. Hartley?" Elsie brightened a little at being asked for details. I helped her dress for dinner, as usual. She was in her blue wool frock, the one she liked for evenings at home. After dinner, I cleared away and went off to my sister's. When I came back later to collect my things, the lights were still on upstairs. I thought Mrs. Hartley might need help undressing, but I didn't like to disturb her so late. That's when I saw the other lady leaving. Did you see the emerald dress at any point that evening? Miss Marple asked. Elsie shook her head. No, miss. Mrs. Hartley never brought that green thing out again after she sent it back. She told me herself it reminded her of bad times in London, said it made her feel cheap and foolish. Miss Marple left the cottage with a clearer picture forming. Someone, very likely Caroline Despard, had visited Rose Cottage secretly after dinner. The parcel had arrived earlier. Sylvia had opened it, read the accompanying note, and then what? Had she been persuaded to try the dress on once more, perhaps in a moment of weakness or nostalgia? Or had the visitor forced the issue? She decided to confront Caroline Despard directly. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Despard was packing her bag, clearly preparing to return to London. She looked startled when Miss Marple was announced, but recovered her composure quickly. Back again, Miss Marple. You really are persistent. I find persistence useful when lives have been taken, Miss Marple replied mildly, taking the offered seat, especially when the victim was dressed against her will in a garment that symbolized pain for her. Caroline's hand paused on the lid of her suitcase. What exactly are you implying? I am not implying, Mrs. Despard. I am observing. You were in the village the night Sylvia died. A tall woman was seen leaving Rose Cottage around 10:30. You had strong feelings about Sylvia's marriage, feelings strong enough to argue with her publicly, and you knew the history of that emerald dress better than almost anyone. Caroline sat down slowly, her face pale but defiant. Yes, I was here. I came to see Sylvia one last time. I wanted to convince her to leave Gerald and come back to London with me. The play Leonard was producing would have been perfect for her. I brought the dress myself. I collected it from the shop using a note I forged in her name. I thought if she saw it again, if she remembered how beautiful she looked in it on stage, she might remember who she really was. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, though her eyes were keen. And did she remember? Caroline's eyes filled with sudden tears. Real ones, Miss Marple thought. She did put it on. We argued at first. She said the dress brought back memories of Victor Lang and how he had humiliated her. But I told her that was the past. I helped her into it, arranged her hair, even found her white gloves. She looked stunning. For a moment, she was the old Sylvia again, laughing, excited about the future. Then she said she felt dizzy. She lay down on the bed and told me to go, that she would talk to Gerald in the morning. I left her there, wearing the dress, looking like a queen. I thought she had finally chosen freedom. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. You left her alive, wearing the dress? Yes, Caroline whispered. Alive and beautiful, I swear it. Then someone came after you, Miss Marple said softly. Someone who found her in that dress and decided to make her final performance permanent. Caroline buried her face in her hands. I never meant her harm. I loved her. In my own way, I loved her more than Gerald ever could. Miss Marple left the Blue Boar with a heavy heart. Caroline's confession had the ring of truth, yet it left a dangerous gap. If Caroline had left Sylvia alive and dressed, then who had administered the poison? And why had the murderer not removed the dress or altered the scene? She walked slowly toward the church, where she found Dr. Haydock sitting on a bench in the churchyard, enjoying the pale sunshine. He greeted her with a tired smile. "Any progress, Jane?" "Some," she replied, sitting beside him. "But the human heart remains the most complicated puzzle of all. Jealousy, love, regret, they twist together in ways that make murder almost understandable, though never excusable." Haydock nodded. The alkaloid used was definitely from a theatrical source, a rare sedative some actors use for stage fright. Expensive and not easy to obtain. Leonard Vale would have access to such things through his productions. "Or someone close to him," Miss Marple murmured. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a telephone call from Inspector Slack. The police had traced the handwriting on the note that accompanied the dress. It was not a perfect forgery after all. Small inconsistencies in the loops of the letters suggested it had been written by someone familiar with Sylvia's hand, but not expert at imitation. Someone who had practiced, but not enough. "Caroline Despard?" Slack asked. "Possibly," Miss Marple said, "but I think there is another player still in the shadows." As evening fell, she sat once more by her window with her knitting. Oh, the blue shawl was nearly finished now, soft and warm for the vicarage baby. But her thoughts were on Sylvia Hartley, lying in her emerald silk, surprised in her final moments. Someone had wanted her to break her vow. Someone had wanted the village and the world to see her in the dress she had rejected. It was a statement as much as a crime. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the gathering dusk. "Pride," she said softly to herself, "the sin that goes before a fall. And in this case, before a very carefully staged death." She looked out at the quiet street where lights were beginning to glow in cottage windows. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, or perhaps back in London, the person who had completed the cruel performance was waiting, confident that the old lady with the knitting would never see the final thread. But Miss Marple had seen many performances in her long life, and she had learned that the most dangerous actors were those who believed their audience was blind. The revelation from Caroline Despard lingered in Miss Marple's mind like the faint scent of the expensive perfume that still clung to Sylvia's dressing room. If Caroline had truly left her friend alive and radiant in the emerald silk, then the murderer had entered Rose Cottage some time after 10:30. A narrow window of opportunity that made the crime feel even more intimate and daring. Someone had slipped in, found Sylvia perhaps drowsy or trusting, and ensured that the performance ended in death rather than departure. Miss Marple spent the next morning in quiet contemplation, her hands busy with the final rows of the blue shawl, while her thoughts wove a different pattern, as she had always believed that the smallest human gestures revealed the largest truths. A single missing glove, a forged note with imperfect loops, a parcel delivered with theatrical precision. These were not the marks of a cold professional killer, but of someone driven by passion, someone who wanted Sylvia's last moments to carry a personal signature. By midday, she decided it was time to speak again with Leonard Vale. She found him at the Blue Boar, where he had extended his stay, claiming he wanted to be available for the police. He greeted her with his usual polished charm, though there was a new wariness in his eyes. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. Have you come to accuse me of murder over tea and scones?" She smiled gently as she took the chair he offered. "Accusation is a strong word, Mr. Vale. I prefer observation. You knew Sylvia better than most in her London days. You offered her a way back to the stage. You wrote her letters full of hope and persuasion. Tell me, did you send her a parcel on the day she died?" Vale's hand paused as he poured her tea. For the briefest moment, His smooth facade cracked. "A parcel? No, why would I?" "Because someone did," Miss Marple said calmly. "A parcel containing the emerald dress, and a note urging her to wear it one last time. The handwriting was meant to look like Sylvia's, but it was not perfect. You are a man of the theatre, Mr. Vale. You understand costumes, lighting, and the power of a dramatic exit." He set the teapot down with deliberate care. "I loved Sylvia in my way. Not the ordinary domestic love Gerald offered, but the kind that sees potential and wants to set it free. Yes, I wanted her back on stage. I even suggested she could stay with me until she found her feet again. But murder? That is absurd. I create illusions for audiences, Miss Marple, not tragedies in real bedrooms." "Yet illusions can spill into reality," Miss Marple replied softly, "especially when jealousy is involved. Caroline Despard told me she helped Sylvia into the dress that night. She left her alive. Someone came after her. Someone who knew the house well enough to enter quietly, perhaps through the side gate near the apple trees." Vale's expression darkened. Caroline has always been possessive. She hated the idea of Sylvia belonging to anyone else. Husband, lover, or theatre. If she left Sylvia alive, then perhaps she returned later. Or perhaps Gerald himself could not bear the thought of losing her to London. Miss Marple noted the quick shift of blame. "Mr. Hartley seems genuinely heartbroken. Grief like his is difficult to feign so completely." "Grief can hide many things," Vale said, "including guilt. Sylvia told me once that Gerald had grown suspicious of her letters. He accused her of having an affair, with me or with Caroline, or both. He was jealous in that quiet, steady way of his, the kind that festers." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who looked even more exasperated than usual. He had new information from London. The theatrical costumier confirmed that the dress had been collected by a woman using Sylvia's name, but the description matched Caroline Despard more closely than anyone else. However, a second detail had emerged. A small bottle of the rare alkaloid had been purchased 2 weeks earlier by someone presenting credentials from Leonard Vale's production company. The buyer had signed as L. Vale Assistant, a vague but convenient title. Slack fixed Vale with a hard stare. "Care to explain that, sir?" Vale laughed, but the sound was forced. "My assistant handles many things. Costumes, props, even medicines for nervous actors. I can't be expected to track every purchase." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "The alkaloid is not commonly used in ordinary medicine, Mr. Vale. It requires knowledge and access. Someone mixed it carefully, enough to be fatal when combined with a sedative, but not so obvious as to suggest immediate violence. It was meant to look like a tragic accident or suicide, or to perhaps brought on by unhappiness in her marriage." After Slack left with a reluctant promise to check Vale's alibi more thoroughly, Miss Marple walked back through the village. The afternoon sun warmed the stone walls and made the daffodils glow along the lanes. She stopped at the vicarage to deliver the finished blue shawl. The vicar's wife thanked her warmly, but even there the shadow of Sylvia's death lingered. "Such a beautiful young woman," the vicar's wife said, "and so full of life. It seems wrong that someone would take that from her, and in such a cruel, theatrical way." Miss Marple nodded. Theatrical indeed. The dress, the careful arrangement of her hair, the single glove left behind as though dropped in haste. It was staged for an audience, even if that audience was only the police and the village gossips. That evening, Sir Gerald Hartley came to call on Miss Marple unexpectedly. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped under the weight of suspicion that now hung over him as well. The police had questioned him again about the parcel and the missing hours on the night of the murder. "I was in my study the whole time," he insisted, sitting heavily in Miss Marple's comfortable armchair, "working on papers. I heard Sylvia moving upstairs, drawers, footsteps, soft laughter even, as though she was talking to herself or on the telephone. I thought she was happy, perhaps trying on something new. Around midnight, I went up. She was already gone. The dress was perfect on her, as though she had prepared for a grand evening, but she never liked that dress. Why would she choose it then?" Miss Marple poured him a small glass of her homemade damson wine. "Because someone wanted her to, Mr. Hartley. Someone who knew the power that old memories hold. The dress represented everything she had tried to leave behind. The betrayal by Victor Lang, the excitement and pain of the stage, the pull of London. Wearing it again was meant to be both a punishment and a farewell." Gerald's eyes filled with pain. "I only wanted to make her happy here. I knew she missed the theatre, but I thought our life together would be enough. If I had been less jealous, less demanding, perhaps she would still be alive." "Jealousy is a heavy burden," Miss Marple said kindly, "but it does not always lead to murder. Tell me, did you ever meet Caroline Despard or Leonard Vale?" "Only briefly. Caroline came once for tea. She looked at me as though I were a jailer. Vale sent flowers after the wedding, beautiful but somehow mocking. I found Sylvia crying over one of his letters once. She said it was nothing, just nostalgia, but I could see how it stirred her." Miss Marple watched him carefully. His grief seemed real, yet she could not ignore the possibility that a quiet, conventional man might snap when faced with the loss of the woman he adored. Still, something in his manner, the way he spoke of Sylvia with lingering tenderness, made her doubt he was the one who had dressed her so carefully in death. As Gerald left, Miss Marple stood at her door and watched him walk slowly down the lane toward Rose Cottage, now a house of memories rather than a home. The moon was rising again, silvering the roofs and casting long shadows across the gardens, and she returned to her chair and picked up a fresh piece of knitting, this time a small scarf in soft grey wool. The rhythm steadied her thoughts. 2 visitors that night, Caroline Despard, who admitted helping Sylvia into the dress and then leaving. Then someone else, someone who had access to the rare poison, who knew the house well enough to enter quietly, and who had both the skill and the cruelty to turn a moment of reconciliation or weakness into final silence. The single white glove still troubled her. One glove found on the floor, the other missing. It suggested haste, or perhaps a deliberate clue left behind. And the theatre programme scrap with its warning, "Tonight at 8, don't wear the green, he will be there." Who was he? Victor Lang, the old betrayer, Leonard Vale, or someone else entirely? Miss Marple's needles clicked on in the quiet room. The dress had been worn again, against every vow Sylvia had made. But vows, like dresses, could be forced upon the unwilling. And in St. Mary Mead, even the quietest resident could recognize when a performance had one final, fatal curtain call. Tomorrow, she decided, she would look more closely at the missing glove and the exact timing of that second visitor. Because somewhere in the tangle of love, jealousy, and old promises lay the truth, and the hands that had both dressed and killed Sylvia Hartley. The next day dawned with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of lilacs from the gardens along the high street. St. Mary Mead appeared its usual peaceful self, children laughing on their way to school, the postman whistling as he made his rounds, and the church clock striking the hours with reassuring steadiness. Yet for those who looked closely, the shadow over Rose Cottage had grown darker. Whispers now included Gerald Hartley's name more frequently, and Inspector Slack's car was seen parked outside the Blue Boar once again. Miss Marple chose to spend the morning in the village library, a small but well-kept room attached to the Institute. She requested the London newspapers from the week before Sylvia's death, and settled into a quiet corner with her spectacles perched on her nose. Among the theatre pages, she found a small announcement. Leonard Vale's new production, Shadows of the Garden, was in rehearsal, with casting still open for a key female role. The description of the character, a woman torn between love and ambition, sounded uncomfortably like Sylvia herself. Archie was about to close the paper when a small advertisement caught her eye. It was from a theatrical supplier. Lost, 1 pair of white evening gloves, size 6.5. Generous reward. Contact LV Productions. The date was the day after Sylvia's death. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her handbag. The missing glove was no longer just a detail in the bedroom. It had travelled to London in someone's pocket. That afternoon she invited Dr. Haydock for tea. The old doctor arrived promptly, his bag left by the door as though he expected another emergency call at any moment. They sat in the garden under the apple tree, where the blossoms were just beginning to fade. "You look as though you've solved it already, Jane," he said, accepting a slice of seed cake. "Or at least narrowed it down to 3 people." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not solved, dear doctor, but the picture is becoming clearer. Caroline Despard admits she helped Sylvia into the dress and left her alive. Leonard Vale had access to the poison through his productions. Gerald Hartley was in the house the entire evening. One of them returned, or stayed, to finish what was started." Haydock stirred his tea thoughtfully. "The alkaloid acts quickly when mixed with alcohol or a sedative. Sylvia likely had a nightcap. She sometimes did after a busy day. If the poison was slipped into her glass while she was still wearing the dress, she would have had little time to react." The surprise on her face makes sense. She expected conversation or reconciliation, not death. "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "The dress was not chosen by accident. It was meant to be her final costume. Someone wanted her to die as the woman she had tried to leave behind. The actress who had been betrayed. The friend who had been pulled in different directions. It was a cruel kind of poetry." She told him about the advertisement for the missing glove and the theatre programme scrap with its warning about he. Haydock's bushy eyebrows rose. "Victor Lang," he suggested. "The man who broke her heart years ago. Could he be involved?" "I thought of that," Miss Marple replied. "But he has been living in America for the past 2 years. I checked through my nephew Raymond's contacts. No, the he is someone closer. Someone who was in St. Mary Mead, or could reach it easily that night." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who looked hot and frustrated, and he had just come from questioning Leonard Vale again. "The man is slippery as an eel," Slack grumbled, accepting a cup of tea. "He claims his assistant bought the alkaloid for research into a new play about a poisoning. Research! As if that excuses having a deadly substance lying about." Miss Marple passed him the seed cake. "And the white glove, Inspector. Have you found its mate?" Slack paused mid-bite. "How did you know about that? We found only one in the bedroom. The other has vanished. It was advertised in the London papers as lost property from LV Productions," Miss Marple said mildly. A generous reward offered. Rather careless, don't you think, to lose one glove from a pair, and then advertise so publicly? Slack set his cup down with a clatter. Fail. It has to be him. He must have taken the second glove when he left. Perhaps it had incriminating marks on it, fingerprints, or a trace of the poison. Or perhaps it was dropped elsewhere, Miss Marple suggested. In the garden, near the side gate, or even inside the house, but hidden. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk past Rose Cottage. The windows were dark except for a single light in Gerald Hartley's study. She hesitated, then knocked softly on the door. Gerald answered, looking more composed than he had in recent days, though his eyes were still shadowed. Miss Marple, come in. I was just going through some more of Sylvia's things. The police have asked for anything that might help. He led her into the drawing room, where several boxes stood open on the floor. Among the papers and photographs, Miss Marple noticed a small bundle of theatre programmes. One was from the Moonlit Garden, the play Sylvia had done with Leonard Vale. Tucked inside was a faded photograph of Sylvia in the emerald dress on stage, laughing beside a younger Vale. On the back, in Sylvia's handwriting, "The night everything changed never again." Miss Marple studied it carefully. She kept this, even though the dress brought pain. She kept many things she said she wanted to forget, Gerald said quietly. I found letters from Caroline too, passionate ones, almost like love letters. I never realized how deep their friendship ran. It made me jealous, I admit. But I never wished her harm. I only wanted her to choose me fully. Miss Marple's voice was kind. Jealousy is a very human emotion, Mr. Hartley. It can make even good men do foolish things. But murder requires something colder, a willingness to stage a death as theatre. She asked to see the side gate near the apple trees. Gerald showed her willingly. The gate was old, the latch slightly loose. In the soft earth beside the path, protected by overhanging branches, Miss Marple spotted a faint impression, the heel of a woman's shoe, size rather larger than Sylvia's. And caught on a low branch was a tiny scrap of dark wool, perhaps from a scarf or coat. She did not point it out immediately. Instead, she said, "Someone came this way after Carolyn left. Someone who knew the garden well enough not to stumble in the dark." Gerald looked troubled. I heard nothing, but I was working with the wireless on low, some music to keep me company. If there was a visitor, Sylvia must have let them in herself. She trusted too easily. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Gerald suddenly remembered something. There was one more thing. When I found her, her right hand was clenched. The police took a small object from it, a button, I think, silver, with a small engraving. They said it might have come from a man's jacket. Miss Marple's interest quickened, though she kept her expression serene. A man's button. Not Caroline, then, unless she had torn it from someone else. The circle was narrowing. Later that night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window with a shawl around her shoulders. The village was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl. She thought of Sylvia, young and lovely, caught between three strong personalities. A husband who offered stability but demanded loyalty. A theatrical friend who offered excitement but demanded possession. And a producer who offered glory but perhaps carried his own hidden resentments. The dress had been the weapon as much as the poison. It had been chosen to wound the spirit before the body. Someone had wanted Sylvia to die, remembering her failures, her broken promises, her old loves. But the single glove and the silver button suggested haste at the end, a moment when the murderer's careful plan had slipped. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the darkened outline of Rose Cottage in the distance. "Tomorrow," she murmured to the quiet night, "the final threads must be pulled. Because no performance, however cleverly staged, can hide the truth forever from someone who has spent a lifetime watching human nature unfold in a small village." She picked up her knitting once more, not the blue shawl this time, but a new piece in deep green wool. The colour was deliberate. As the needles clicked softly, she felt the pattern of the crime coming together at last. One more day, and the dress that Sylvia swore she would never wear again would finally tell its full story, not through words, but through the small telling details that only a patient, observant old lady could see. The final morning arrived wrapped in the soft golden light that only an English spring can offer. St. Mary Mead woke as usual, but an undercurrent of expectation hung in the air. The word had quietly spread that Inspector Slack had summoned several people to Rose Cottage for a meeting at 11 o'clock. Miss Marple, invited as a person of interest whose observations might prove helpful, walked slowly up the garden path, her knitting bag on her arm, and a calm expression on her face. Inside the drawing room, the atmosphere was tense. Gerald Hartley stood by the fireplace, pale but composed. Caroline Despard sat rigidly on the edge of a chair, her usual sharpness dulled by sleepless nights. Leonard Vale leaned against the window, attempting nonchalance, though his fingers drummed nervously on the sill. Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and a sergeant with a notebook completed the gathering. Miss Marple took a modest seat near the door, her hands folded quietly. Slack cleared his throat. "We're here because the evidence now points clearly to the person responsible for Sylvia Hartley's death. The poison, the dress, the timing, all of it has been traced. But before charges are made, Miss Marple has asked to explain certain details. I've agreed because, well, her record speaks for itself." All eyes turned to the old lady in grey. Miss Marple smiled gently, as though she were discussing the church flower rota rather than murder. "Thank you, Inspector. It has been a most instructive case. So much emotion, so many tangled affections. Sylvia was loved, or at least desired, by each of you in different ways. And that love, twisted by jealousy and pride, led to her death." She turned first to Caroline Despard. "You admitted helping Sylvia into the emerald dress, Mrs. Despard. You left her alive shortly after 10:30, and believing she had chosen freedom at last. Your motive was possessive love. You wanted her back in the world you shared, away from what you saw as a stifling marriage. You even collected the dress from the shop and forged the note to persuade her. But you did not kill her." Caroline let out a shaky breath, tears glistening in her eyes. Miss Marple continued softly. "The person who came next through the side gate knew the garden well. Someone who had lived in this house, who could move quietly even with the wireless playing low in the study. Someone who found Sylvia still wearing the dress you had helped her into, looking beautiful and perhaps a little dazed from the late hour and the emotional conversation." Gerald Hartley's face tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "Mr. Hartley, you told me you heard soft laughter and movement upstairs. You believed your wife was happy, perhaps trying on something new. In reality, she was with Caroline. When Caroline left, Sylvia remained in the dress, perhaps undecided, perhaps weakened by old memories stirred up so vividly. You went upstairs around midnight, as you said. But I believe you went up earlier, quietly, and saw her in that green silk. Gerald's hands clenched at his sides. I did go up once. I saw her in the dress. She looked so lovely, like the girl I first fell in love with in London. But then she spoke of leaving, of the new play, of how Caroline and Leonard understood her better than I ever could. I was hurt, angry. I begged her to take it off, to remember the life we had built here. She refused. She said the dress made her feel alive again. In that moment, I lost control for just a few seconds. I had the sedative I sometimes take for insomnia. I mixed a strong dose into her nightcap while she was still talking. I thought it would calm her, make her sleep so we could talk rationally in the morning. I never meant his voice broke. The room was deathly silent. Miss Marple shook her head gently. You meant to calm her, yes. But the alkaloid you added, obtained through a contact in London, you made while handling legal matters for a theatrical client, turned it deadly. You did not know its full strength when combined with the sedative. When you realized what had happened, panic set in. Instead of calling for help, you arranged her neatly on the bed. You wanted her to look peaceful, beautiful. You even tried to remove one of the white gloves she was wearing because it had a small stain from the glass. But in your haste, you dropped the other. That missing glove later appeared in Leonard Vale's lost property advertisement because you, in your shock, posted it anonymously to his office, hoping to cast suspicion elsewhere. Gerald sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. I loved her. I only wanted to keep her here with me. The dress, seeing her in it, was like watching her choose a life without me. I couldn't bear it. Leonard Vale spoke for the first time, his voice hoarse. You killed her because she wanted to wear a dress. Miss Marple turned to him. No, Mr. Vale. He killed her because he could not accept that she was slipping away. The dress was the final symbol. You, Mr. Vale, played your own part. You sent encouraging letters, offered her the role, perhaps even hoped she would turn to you. You purchased the alkaloid, or rather your assistant did on your instructions, but not for murder. You kept it for research, as you claimed. Yet you also lost a glove that night, the mate to the one found in the bedroom. In your visit earlier that evening, before Caroline arrived, you had argued with Sylvia about the new production. She dropped the glove during that argument. You picked it up later when you returned after hearing rumours, but only found one. You advertised the lost one to distance yourself. Vale looked away, unable to deny it entirely. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Caroline once more. You, Mrs. Despard, bear the burden of starting the chain. Your possessive urging brought the dress back into Sylvia's life at the worst possible moment. But none of you acted alone in creating the tragedy. It was the web of human feelings, love, jealousy, ambition, fear of loss, that tightened until it snapped. Inspector Slack nodded slowly. Gerald Hartley, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Sylvia Hartley. The button found in her hand came from your jacket, torn off during the brief struggle when she realized something was wrong with the drink. The shoe print and wool scrap near the gate match. Nothing from Caroline's or Vale's clothing, but the timing and your presence in the house seal it. Gerald did not resist as the sergeant stepped forward. He looked at Miss Marple with exhausted eyes. She was everything to me. I thought if I could just make her stay. How did you know? Oh, Miss Marple. Miss Marple sighed, a small, sad sound, because I have lived long enough to see how small things reveal the heart. The dress she swore she would never wear again was worn with care, not by a stranger, but by someone who still loved her enough to arrange her hair and leave her looking beautiful. Only a husband who adored her would do that, even in panic. The single glove, the imperfect forgery on the note, the way the poison was mixed in a domestic nightcap rather than injected or forced, all spoke of someone inside the house, not an outsider staging a grand revenge. And the surprise on her face, she trusted the person who gave her the drink. As Gerald was led away, the room emptied slowly. Caroline Despard remained behind for a moment, tears streaming down her face. I pushed her too hard. If I had left her in peace. Leonard Vale slipped out without another word, his theatrical world suddenly small and tawdry. Miss Marple walked home with Dr. Haydock. The lilacs were in full bloom now, and birds sang overhead. "You did it again, Jane," the doctor said quietly, "with nothing but knitting needles and observation." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not quite nothing, dear doctor, with an understanding of human nature. People are not so very different in St. Mary Mead as they are in London. Jealousy, love, regret, they wear the same faces everywhere. Sylvia wanted to wear that dress one last time, in her own way. Someone made certain she did, but at a terrible cost." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window and picked up her knitting once more. The new piece in deep green wool was growing steadily, and she would finish it and give it away, perhaps to the vicarage, as a small reminder that even the brightest colours can carry shadows. Outside, life in the village continued. Children played, bells rang, and the daffodils nodded in the breeze. Rose Cottage would stand empty for a while, its roses climbing the walls as though nothing had changed. But Miss Marple knew better. Nothing ever stayed completely hidden in St. Mary Mead. Not secrets, not sins, and certainly not the quiet truth that lay behind a beautiful emerald dress a young woman had once sworn she would never wear again. And so, with gentle hands and a thoughtful heart, the old lady continued her knitting, while the universe turned on, indifferent, mysterious, and endlessly human.